Good morning and welcome to employer legal ramifications of the COVID vaccine. We're happy to have Erick Becker, attorney with the Cummins White, back with us. Again, my name is Travis Chepkema, president of Church and Casualty Insurance Agency. We have the honor of insuring nearly 7,000 houses of worship and making us the largest insurer of houses of worship in the entire Southwestern United States. And we're excited about that and glad you're along, whether you're insured with us or not, to be informed and learn. I wanted to intro here Julie Ludwig, our marketing coordinator. Big thanks to Julie for setting this up and putting it all together. So thank you. She will be involved a little bit later. I'll tell you about that. But I wanted to get into, before we start the webinar, just a couple of slides that we'll talk about regarding one of our value-added services, which is thinkhr.com. So since we're talking about employment-related issues today, employer and employment-related issues today, I wanted to show you just a couple quick slides of our free service. That's my favorite price, free, for our insureds, and that's ThinkHR. So Julie, if you'll share that screen. This first one is a screen that we have that it shows your home page. So when you sign up as a customer with ThinkHR, this will be your customized home page where you can work with things such as a living handbook. So you can build an employee handbook on there. You can have compliance issues with HR. You can follow along there. You can learn, get courses and certificates, HR related. And you have a benefits document creator as well. Many, many things here that are available for free by being a customer of ours. And over to the right, you can also see that you have access to an HR, whoops, we lost it, Julie. Well, that's okay. You have access to an HR expert you can ask questions to online as well. So if you're a customer of ours, we want to make sure you're taking full advantage of that and using that service. If you're not a customer of ours and want to learn more about it, please reach out to us and we can show you the benefits of that service that we provide, again, to all of our customers. I'm not sure if you're able to pull up that second slide, Julie. If not, we can move along. We'll give it a shot here. Adobe didn't seem to be cooperating. Can you get it or not? You can? I'll tell you. All right, here we go. I just wanted to show you briefly this second slide, which ThinkHR can provide for you. Go ahead and scroll down when you can. Oh, we got the blue circle of death. Okay, well, that's okay. That's okay. We can maybe show it at the end, Julie. We can just come out of that. Oh, maybe we got it. Hey, there it is. Awesome. Thank you. You can get your own personal report on the dollars that you're saving by using ThinkHR. And this is our entire year of 2020. This is what our customers saved. And you can see at the top, their total value of services, $953,000 were saved by Church and Casualty customers on HR related items just by using ThinkHR. You can see the live consultations below, the courses completed, the comply views, the handbooks completed. So it's a great service. Again, if you're not taking full use of that as one of our customers, get in touch with us and we'll make sure you get set up and are moving forward on that. And again, if you want to learn more about it and you're not insured with us, please reach out to us and talk to us. One other item, and we can come out of that slide, Julie, thank you so much. One other item about it is that in California, as you know, moved the sexual harassment prevention training from 50 employees or more down to 5. And so that is included for free on thinkhr.com. So you can get that mandatory sexual harassment prevention training on thinkhr.com as well. All right, with that said, before we get to our moving forward, I wanted to let you know that this will be recorded. So that's one of our number one questions. It will be recorded. And if you are attending today, you will get a copy of it sent to you, as well as we will post this to our website. So just so you know, it is being recorded today. Secondly, we will be taking private questions off to the side. Not everyone will see them throughout the webinar. I would ask, if you do ask a question, please make it as succinct and as brief as possible. And Erick has been so kind to us in the past to answer as many as he can the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. We'll wrap up exactly at 11 o'clock today. This will be one total hour. But we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And then he's been kind enough, even after the fact, to hit some of the questions that weren't able to be answered within this hour. So we'll be taking those as we go through and then addressing those at the end. So without further ado, Erick, it's a pleasure to have you back with us. You know, in our world, it's great to sometimes find an attorney that really knows what they're talking about, combined with being a great presenter, and that doesn't always happen. And so we are fortunate to find Erick and connect with him over the years. And you're in for a great treat today, as COVID vaccine and return to work, and what does that mean for us is at the forefront of everyone's mind. So with that said, Erick, thanks for being here. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Travis. I appreciate the kind words. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending. As Travis introduced me previously, my name is Erick Becker. I work for a law firm, Cummins White in Newport Beach, and I practice exclusively in the areas of labor and employment law, representing employers. What I'm going to be talking about today is something that, as Travis mentioned, is on everybody's mind, and that is the COVID vaccines, vaccination. What does that mean for the workplace? Can we require people to be vaccinated? Can we incentivize people to be vaccinated? What are the pay implications of that? What are some of the rules regarding employees who are reluctant to get the vaccine, and what accommodations may be necessary for employees who refuse to be vaccinated? So there's a lot of different aspects of this. I am certainly getting a lot of questions about this currently. And so I thought it would be a good topic to cover with all of you. The one caveat I want to share at the outset is, like everything COVID related, things seem to be changing on a daily basis. Whether it's the rules regarding mandatory vaccination, whether it's the rules regarding how do you compensate people if you're requiring them to be vaccinated, et cetera. So my caveat is, if at some point down the road, June, September, whatever the case may be, you decide to implement some sort of vaccination policy, it would be in your best interest to check with counsel, check with Think HR, make sure that you get the most updated information on this topic before you go forward, because here we are on April 14th, and who knows what's going to be coming out over the next months and even years that may change what employers are allowed to do and what employers have to do when it comes to this topic of vaccination. So the first thing that I wanted to cover, and this is a question that I seem to be getting on a daily basis right now, is whether or not employers, and when we talk about employers in California, we're talking about, for-profit, nonprofit, doesn't make a difference, whether employers can require their employees to get vaccinated. So let's talk about that particular aspect of this. So can employers require employees to get vaccinated with one of the COVID-19 vaccinations as a condition of employment? And prior to all of this, prior to February and March of last year, it was pretty well accepted that, and this, when I say well accepted, I mean by the government agencies that oversee this kind of thing, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in California, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. It was pretty well accepted that vaccination could be a mandatory requirement in the workplace. For instance, a lot of employers prior to COVID required people to get vaccinated against the flu, particularly in healthcare, but even outside of healthcare. Employers adopted mandatory flu vaccine programs because we know that if the flu goes through a workplace, that can significantly impact people, have an impact on productivity, et cetera. So prior to COVID, it was pretty well accepted that you could mandate vaccination against diseases like the flu. But of course, like everything else with COVID, it was a new thing. And so there was a lot of questions posed to the EEOC and DFEH at the outset as to whether or not mandatory vaccine policies are permissible. And both those agencies have now given guidance for employers that you can require, as a condition of employment, vaccination against COVID. And quoting directly from both the EEOC and DFEH guidance, employers may require vaccination with an FDA-approved vaccine as a condition of employment. Now, there has been a question that has arisen over the last couple months as to whether or not the current vaccines that are out there, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, whether those are approved FDA vaccines for purposes of this guidance. And some have argued that under the emergency use authorizations, wow, that's a tough one. Under those emergency authorizations from the FDA, vaccination, and this is set out in the FDA authorizations, vaccination is voluntary. So how can an employer require employees to get vaccinated when there's only an emergency use authorization? But the vast majority of commentators, including the DFEH, have said the emergency use authorization is a form of approval and it is sufficient for requiring mandatory vaccination. In other words, you don't have to wait until the FDA gives final approval on these vaccinations, which could be a couple of years down the road. However, I will caution you, that's not crystal clear yet, but over the last couple of weeks, as this question has been posed to various agencies, that seems to be where things are going. So the EUAs are sufficient at this point that employers can require Moderna or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson. Now, I will caution you, of course, that if there's some other vaccine, the vaccine out of China, the Sputnik vaccine out of Russia, which I don't think are available here, but you couldn't require anything that's not FDA approved, and that would include AstraZeneca. Now, as we'll talk about in more detail, if you do have a mandatory vaccination policy, you must recognize certain exemptions for employees who have medical conditions, disabilities, or they have sincerely held religious beliefs. And we'll talk in more detail about what those exemptions are and how to approach that. But at the outset, it's important to recognize that you can't have this as a blanket across the board. Everybody must be vaccinated or else. Other considerations that you have to take into account if you're going to implement some sort of mandatory vaccination policy is what kind of proof are you going to require for people to prove that they have been vaccinated? Is it the vaccine card? Do they have to show it to you? Are you going to keep a copy, et cetera? Another important consideration is, are you requiring people to get vaccinated by an employer-sponsored program? In other words, you contract with a pharmacy or some other agency to come in and provide the vaccines to the employees, or you require your employees to go to a certain vaccination site that is sponsored by you, you're paying for it, you're going to require everybody to get vaccinated at that site. When you have an employer-sponsored vaccination program, that creates some issues in terms of record keeping the confidentiality of the information, the medical information employees may share, as well as what kind of vaccination questions can be asked of employees. So there's some issues there. Now, most people are not doing that. Most employers that have adopted mandatory vaccination programs have just relied on third parties. But if you're contemplating that, you need to take that into account. And there's also leave and pay issues, which I'm going to talk about in more detail a little bit later. But the upshot of all of this is that if you decide that you want to make sure that everybody's vaccinated to protect the health and safety of employees and congregants and parishioners, or whatever the case may be, you can do that under current law. So let's talk about some of the details regarding vaccination programs. So if you are an employer-sponsored provider where you're providing the vaccinations through an on-site provider, or you're requiring people to go to a clinic that you've contracted with so that vaccinations can be provided to your employees, you are an employer-sponsored provider. And that creates some issues. As I mentioned previously, under EEOC and DFEH guidelines, you cannot ask employees questions about their medical condition as in relation to employment, going into detail. That is what called pre-screening, and that creates some issues in terms of discrimination against people with disabilities. And for those of you who have received vaccination for COVID, you know that as part of that process, you are asked certain questions about your medical condition, whether you've had any allergic reactions to vaccines in the past, whether you're pregnant or breastfeeding, et cetera, et cetera. So when the employer is sponsoring it, even if the clinic is the one asking the questions, that can create some legal issues for the employer. So just, be aware if you're considering sponsoring a vaccination program, you need to be doubly careful, particularly in protecting the information that you're gathering from employees. Any records relating to vaccination, whether it's the pre-screening questions, whether it's proof of vaccination, as we'll talk about a little bit later, you must keep all those records confidential. And they must be kept separately from the employee's personnel file so that only the least amount of people within your organization have access to that information. Because that is, when you become the employer sponsor, you're taking on the requirements of HIPAA for protecting the health information of employees, because you are now considered a medical provider. So again, there's some reasons why it's best to have a third-party provider be the one providing vaccines in a mandatory vaccination program, whether that's the doctor's office, whether that's a pharmacy, whether that's the county sites that have been sponsored at various counties throughout the state. When you have a third-party provider, their screening of the employee does not create issues for the employer. Even if you're requiring vaccination as a condition of employment, the fact that the doctor's office is asking those questions to employees prior to giving them the vaccine doesn't create issues for you. And that's probably the biggest reason why it's best to have third-party vaccination even under mandatory vaccination. Now, if you are going to have any type of either mandatory vaccination program or a incentive program for vaccination, which I'll talk about in a little bit, it's important to have some sort of written vaccination policy in place, particularly if you're going to have mandatory vaccination. Because if you're going to have mandatory vaccination, you have to make sure that you're communicating effectively what the expectations are for when vaccination has to take place. Because obviously, it depends on availability. Now that Johnson & Johnson is been taken offline, at least for a while, there's a lot of questions on whether or not that is going to impact availability of vaccines. And of course, eligibility. Right now, it's been opened up to everybody over 16, but that could vary by county to county. And so you need to make sure that your policy gives people enough time and makes exceptions for situations where they are just unable to get vaccinated within the time limits that you've set forth in the policy. You also have to set forward in that policy the procedure for requesting exemption. If someone is going to assert that one of the exemptions should excuse them from being vaccinated, there should be a specific procedure set forth, which I'll talk about in more detail, but that needs to be in your policy. You also need to have procedures for how employees provide proof of vaccination. Who are they going to show that proof to? What kind of proof is required? How will that proof be stored, etc. And it's important that employees are made aware of your practices for maintaining confidentiality of that information. Something in your policy needs to say, we recognize our obligations to keep employee medical information confidential and private, and it will be kept in separate files that are not available to all within the company, only a select few on a need-to-know basis, or something like that. Now, the other thing that your policy should set forth is, what are the consequences? If an employee doesn't have one of those recognized exemptions and simply says, I don't want to take the vaccine. I had somebody ask me this question yesterday regarding a person saying, well, I just don't want to take it. I don't think it's safe. What are you going to do in those circumstances? Are you going to make accommodations, or are you going to say vaccination is a condition of employment, and if you refuse to be vaccinated and you're not exempt, that's going to lead to suspension or termination? You need to think about those things and set out those clear expectations for employees in your policy. It is required to have the exemptions and the procedures for requesting exemption set forth in your written policy. That is what the DFEH and the EEOC say. It is not enough to simply verbally communicate to employees that if they have a medical condition, they can be exempted. And another important part of your written vaccine policy should be addressing pay. Pay for time spent obtaining the vaccine and any expenses incurred, which I'll talk about in more detail a little bit later. So let's get into the exemptions, starting with the first exemption, which is the exemption for medical reasons. This is an exemption that's recognized under the law if an employee has a medical condition or a disability that makes it medically advisable for them to refrain from being vaccinated, then you cannot require them to be vaccinated as a condition of employment. So that could be a direct medical contraindication. So for instance, there are some people who have allergic reactions to vaccines in general, or to specific components of vaccines. And there are different components in the various vaccines that are out there, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, that people can be allergic to. And if there is a direct contraindication, against use of that vaccine, then that would be a recognized exemption, and you would have to excuse that employee from being vaccinated. But it could also be an indirect medical contraindication because of a disability or a medical condition that creates risk for people being vaccinated. What are some examples? Immune compromised individuals, folks with autoimmune conditions, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, that sometimes can lead to a medical directive that they not be vaccinated. Another could be employees who are pregnant or breastfeeding. That would be an indirect contraindication. So in those circumstances, again, an employee can be exempted. Now, how does an employee go about getting exemption? They can't just come in and say, well, my doctor says I shouldn't get a vaccine, so I should be excused. And you don't have to go around and ask people if they have a medical condition that prevents them from being vaccinated. As a matter of fact, that would be one of those pre-screening questionnaires that you have to avoid. The employee has the obligation to submit a request, preferably in writing, and certification from a healthcare provider that they have this condition and that it is advisable by the healthcare provider that they refrain from being vaccinated. Your best practice is to have a written form for that. A written form that employees would submit that contain all the information about what type, that medical conditions or disabilities are going to be exempted, that the employee has the right to request that exemption, and here's the certification that we need from your doctor. If you get notes from doctors that just say, this is to excuse Joe from being vaccinated, and it doesn't give you enough information to determine if there is, in fact, a medical condition or disability that would exempt them, you can request more information, either from the employee or from the doctor's office directly, as to what are the details. If you're going to contact the doctor's office, though, you should probably get permission from the employee. But you don't have to just take a blanket, vague, ambiguous excuse and say, okay, well, you're exempted. There needs to be enough there to indicate that there is a bona fide medical condition or disability. Again, all the information you receive from the employee regarding exemption has to be stored in separate confidential files. If somebody does establish that there is an exemption, then you must accommodate that exemption. And what does that mean? First, like any other disability, you need to engage in an interactive process. You need to talk to the employee, have a meeting with the employee, exchange emails with the employee, whatever the case may be, to determine what accommodations may be reasonable in the circumstance. Examples of reasonable accommodations in lieu of vaccination could be allowing the employee to telework, changing their job duties so that they avoid close contact with coworkers or the public, a leave of absence if other accommodations are not possible. I would be very cautious in just excluding the employee from work altogether based on an exemption from vaccination. There should be some accommodation that you can make, even if it's just requiring that employee to remain masked and to stay in a separate area apart from other people, et cetera. Something to protect the health and safety of other employees. But it would not be appropriate to say, no, you asked for this exemption and therefore we're just going to let you go. We're going to terminate you. That would be dangerous. Another thing to keep in mind is you cannot retaliate. If employees say, hey, I have an exemption that should allow me to get out of vaccination and I'm requesting an accommodation, you can't do anything that would be considered to be retaliatory. Reasonable accommodations, like requiring them to wear masks, et cetera, would not be retaliatory. Demoting them, cutting their hours, things like that, that would run the risk of a retaliation claim. So let's talk about the next exemption, which is the exemption for religious reasons. This is the second exemption that is recognized by the EEOC and DFEH. This is an exemption for employees who have, and this is the phrase used, a sincerely held religious belief objecting to vaccination. So that creates a little bit of difficulty in figuring out what is a sincerely held religious belief. But it's important to recognize that some religious faiths, a theistic or organized religion such as Christian Science, have objections to vaccines as part of their doctrine. But it's not required for this exemption for the employee to be a member of or affiliated with an organized religion in order to have a sincerely held religious belief. It can be a belief that is unrelated to organized religious practice, but it has to be a belief that is somehow connected to something that is spiritual in nature, that the employee can explain, as opposed to, well, I don't think vaccines are safe, or I don't think vaccines make sense for me. I just don't believe in them. Well, that's not a sincerely held religious belief. So if someone's going to request the religious exemption, they have to make that request. Once again, it's best to have a written form. You don't have to go around to employees and ask if they have a religious reason. The employee's got to come forward. You should have a form for that. Have the employee fill out the form. And as part of this process, the employee can be required either to provide a note from a spiritual leader, or you can require them to provide some sort of more thorough explanation of the beliefs or practices that they hold that would prevent them from being vaccinated in order to determine if that belief is sincerely held. In other words, give me more information that backs up your claim that this is a religious belief that prevents you from being vaccinated. And if someone does come forward with that information and establishes that they're entitled to a religious exemption, then you need to grant reasonable accommodations to that individual, and you should discuss those with the employee. And again, that could be things such as teleworking, continuing to wear a mask, et cetera, et cetera. I'm getting a lot of questions about people who are asserting other beliefs or concerns to vaccination. And certain things that people can bring forward would not qualify for this sincerely held religious exemption. So political exemptions. I think COVID's fake, and this is just Bill Gates trying to track everybody. That is not a valid, sincerely held religious belief. Concerns over vaccine safety or efficacy. Well, I don't think these vaccines work. I think vaccines are dangerous. That's not a sincerely held religious belief and would not be the basis for a religious exemption. Conspiracy theories. Again, there's chips in the vaccine. This is all phony. None of that would be a sincerely held religious belief. And again, you don't have to take the employee's claim at face value. You can do more investigation, ask them to explain more thoroughly in writing why they are refusing vaccination in order for the employee to qualify for this exemption. So let me talk a little bit about pay issues relating to vaccination, because there are some issues that arise when it comes to employees taking time to go get vaccinated, or employees being off work because they are feeling the effects of vaccination. So if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, you are required to pay employees for their time spent going to get vaccinated. If they go get vaccinated, whether that's on their regular work time or not, they're doing so at the requirement of the employer, and therefore that is compensable time. So they must be paid for the time it takes for them to go get vaccinated, and whatever expenses they incur, whether that's the cost of the vaccination, which in most circumstances is free, but maybe a mileage expense, something like that, that's reasonable. You would have to pay for that. So whatever hours they missed, even if it's off shift, you should pay for it if it's a mandatory program. the cost of the vaccine, mileage expense. Those are all things that you should probably cover if you're requiring vaccination. The one question is, if you have a mandatory vaccine policy, do you have to pay for time off due to side effects? And my answer right now would be no. The employee could use their sick leave. They could use other time, paid time off programs. But if you're requiring mandatory vaccination and an employee suffers a side effect, I don't think that is compensable as a separate requirement, because it's not work time. The reason why you got to pay people to go get vaccinated is because you are requiring them to be vaccinated, and therefore it is work time when they're going to get the vaccine itself. But I don't think you have to pay for time off due to side effects, with the caveat we'll talk about when you don't have mandatory, whether you have mandatory or not, there are certain circumstances where you're going to have to pay people for the time they're vaccinated and any side effects. And let me explain. California just adopted, effective March 29th, a new COVID supplemental sick pay requirement. It only applies if you have more than 25 employees. So if you have less than 25 employees, you do not need to pay people to go get vaccinated if you're not requiring vaccination. However, if you have more than 25 employees, you're required to give paid time up to 80 hours for vaccine appointments and absence from work due to side effects from vaccination. There's a couple of different things that employees can be eligible to take this supplemental COVID sick pay for. If they get COVID, if they're subject to a quarantine order, but the law specifically also includes vaccine appointments and absence from work due to side effects. So if you fall within that category of more than 25 employees, you're going to have to pay if someone's laid out for 36 hours after they get the vaccine. And you're going to have to pay for the time they spend going to get the vaccine. If you're under that number, 25 or less, you don't have to pay for it unless you're requiring vaccine as a condition of employment. And under this COVID supplemental paid sick leave, just like regular sick leave under the California Healthy Families Act, you can only require proof of the time off, the employee being sick from side effects, if you suspect that they're faking it and they're using that time off for other purposes. They post on Facebook that they're so excited that Disneyland's open and they're going to Disneyland on Friday when they're telling you, oh, I got vaccinated and the side effects are affecting me. So if you have less than 25 employees, the pay is not required. So let's talk for a minute or two about vaccination incentive programs. So this is different from the mandatory vaccination program that we talked about earlier. This is a situation where an employer offers incentives to encourage employees to get vaccinated. And there's nothing prohibiting employers from doing that. You can certainly offer cash bonuses, gift cards, additional time off, vacation or PTO. All of those are incentives that you can offer employees to go get vaccinated. However, if you offer cash, and sorry, there's a typo there, cash equivalent incentives, it can create some wage and hour issues. And let me explain why. Any type of cash or even a gift card is a form of a non-discretionary bonus. And non-discretionary bonuses have to be included with your regular straight time pay when calculating overtime. So let me give you an example to illustrate. Let's say an employee, you have a program that everybody who gets the vaccine, they get a bonus of $100. It's an incentive bonus, straight up, it's added to their paycheck. So let's say an employee earns one of those incentive bonuses and they work 50 hours that week. So they've worked 10 hours of overtime. That employee would then be owed an additional $1 for each overtime hour worked, or $10 total. Because when you add that $100 into their compensation, divide it by 50, that comes out to $2 of extra overtime. But of course, overtime is only paid at half rate. So that would be $1 for each overtime hour worked. I know that's a little bit complicated, but I want to raise it so that you're aware if you do offer those types of incentive programs and people work overtime, you have to give them a little bit additional overtime. And if you ever run into that situation, you should probably get some advice from Think HR or from counsel as to how to make sure you're protected from a wage and hour perspective. The other thing is that these incentive programs for employees who are exempted, you can't discriminate against people with medical or religious exemptions. So if you're offering the $100 cash bonus to people who get vaccinated and someone comes in and submits the paperwork to be exempted, you still have to pay them that bonus. Now, you can put additional requirements on them, such as participating in additional COVID safety training or something else so that they don't just get it automatically. They've got to do something above and beyond to help protect health and safety, even if they can't get vaccinated. But you have to, if you're going to have an incentive program, again, have that written policy and put those caveats in there where employees can receive additional pay, just like the other employees who choose to go get vaccinated and get that bonus. You can't discriminate against them because of their religious or medical conditions. So let's finally talk about what happens if you've got people vaccinated now. What are the workplace rules when people have gone through all of their vaccine treatments and they are now fully vaccinated? Number one, the COVID safety protocols under the OSHA temporary standards, which I talked about previously with this group, they still apply. They have to continue wearing a mask in public areas of the workplace, even if they're vaccinated, and they have to continue social distancing in the workplace, even if they're vaccinated. Now, we don't know when those safety rules may be advised. The rules currently say, we're going to revisit that at some point when vaccination is more commonplace in the population, but they haven't announced any change to that yet. The temporary rules are currently in effect until the end of May. So until you hear otherwise, people can't get out of being masked or following your COVID safety rules just because they've been vaccinated. And hopefully, once vaccination becomes, more widespread, they'll revise those rules. And hopefully by June, we won't have to do all of the machinations that we're required to do now. So that is all the information that I have to share with you. I think it's time now for some questions.
All right, let's get to them. We got some good questions. I'll take these in the order that we received them. First question, Sandy says, does this apply to existing employees or just new hires?
Well, most employers, when it comes to vaccination policies, are applying it to all employees, whether they're new hires or not. But the rules, if you're going to have, it wouldn't make sense to have a vaccine policy that only applies to new hires, because you've still got people in your workplace who could expose others to COVID. So I would think that it would apply across the board.
Okay, great. John asked, the EEOC and DFEH are the authority on this matter and not OSHA or some other agency, ?
Right.
So,
The DFEH and the EEOC have taken the lead in addressing these issues, just as they have in past situations where the question has come up about mandatory vaccination. So OSHA has not, Cal OSHA or federal OSHA have not issued any guidelines regarding requirements for vaccination or exemption or anything like that. As I said, the only thing that Cal OSHA has said is that just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean you're exempt from our safety rules when it comes to COVID.
Okay, and this might apply as well. Phil asked, what if a person was hired before this was implemented? Seems unfair if now a new condition is implemented, which wasn't part of their condition of employment.
Well, employers add conditions of employment all the time. You change your handbook, you can add conditions of employment. That's not out of the ordinary. Again, it's up to your organization as to how you want to approach it. But I could argue the opposite, right? Why should only new hires be required to be vaccinated and everybody else gets off the hook?
Right.
If the purpose of your vaccination policy is to protect the health and safety of the employees and the people they come in contact with.
Got it. Thank you. Anonymous says, is there a template available in writing a policy for mandatory vaccines of employees?
There are templates floating around the internet. I have certainly written some mandatory vaccination policies. So, you know, I would think HR might even have something that they are sharing with people at this juncture.
Definitely possible. I'll definitely look into that. Robin asked, if we make vaccination a requirement for employment, is there any liability if we are to lose in granting an exemption, or if we are too accommodating and allowing the employee to continue working?
That's a great question. If you are following all of the COVID safety guidelines and you adopt a mandatory vaccination policy and you make an exemption for somebody and your reasonable accommodation is to allow them to keep working, I don't think you'd have any liability. You're required by law to grant the exemption. You're taking reasonable steps to protect health and safety of other employees. If something happens, I don't think you could be held liable in that circumstance. And the other thing I would say is if, you know, some unvaccinated employee somehow infects someone else in the workplace, that would be covered by workers' comp anyway.
Got it. Joyce asked, do these same requirements for employees apply to our volunteers?
Well, that is another very good question. If you are going to have a mandatory vaccination policy for volunteers, and again, this is all up to you, right? Nobody's requiring you to have a mandatory vaccination policy. It's up to the organization as to what you want to do. But if you were to adopt such a policy, I think my recommendation would be to have the same exemptions in place that you would for employees.
Okay. Joan asked, what if there could be no reasonable accommodations, for example, a preschool teacher?
So if you have that situation where there's no reasonable accommodation that would allow that unvaccinated employee to continue in their current job, you would still have an obligation to look to see if there were alternate positions available that would not require vaccination, where they could be accommodated and not threaten the health and safety of children or coworkers. Let's just assume a hypothetical where there's just no position for them. There's no accommodation whatsoever. It would depend upon what is the nature of the medical condition and whether or not it's temporary or permanent, right? So let's say it's pregnancy, obviously not permanent. So an accommodation would be in that situation to grant the employee a leave until they're no longer pregnant, they're no longer, breastfeeding or whatever condition that would prevent them from being vaccinated, and then they can go get vaccinated.
Got it. John asked, can a COVID nasal test be required if the employee cannot or refuses to receive the vaccination?
Sure. COVID testing would be, and thank you for asking that question. COVID testing would be another potential accommodation, right? Okay, so you're saying you're not going to get vaccinated because you have a medical exemption. All right, we're going to require you to be tested, twice a week to establish that you don't have it. You'd have to pay for the testing, but yeah, that could be another accommodation. Sure, great question.
I think you hit this one, but they were asking about if they didn't qualify. Robert asked if they don't qualify for the religious exemption, there's other option. Is there another option for them to request an exemption?
No, there's only two recognized exemptions: the medical/disability exemption and the religious exemption. Those are recognized under the law, right?
Okay.
Now, so as an organization, If you want to adopt additional exemptions, you certainly could. Nobody would, prevent you from doing so. But those two exemptions are the ones that you have to grant.
Got it. Rob asked, does this apply to independent contractors as well?
Yes. Independent contractors are covered under the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And so, and under EEOC guidelines. So if someone is an independent contractor and you have a mandatory vaccination policy and they say, I need an exemption, you would have to grant them the exemption the same as you would an employee. It's up to you whether or not, if you're going to adopt a vaccination policy, you apply it to independent contractors as well as employees.
Got it. John mentioned there was something to mention about the 25 employee limit. Is that full-time or all employees, full and part-time?
Full and part-time for the COVID paid sick leave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we answered this one. Michelle asked, only employees are also volunteers. But Michelle also asked about members, attendees, or groups that rent space.
Right. So if you're talking about people who do not have any type of employment equivalent relationship, independent contractors, volunteers, interns, right? They're not employees, but they're kind of close. If you're talking about people who are just coming to the facility, that's a whole nother issue, right? It's a really hot topic right now, vaccine passports, and can organizations require people who are coming to a facility to prove that they're vaccinated? That's not an employment issue, but I think the answer is yes, at least as of right now. And that raises some sticky issues. So I would say if you're going to adopt any type of vaccination policy for the general public, people renting, facility, congregants coming in, that you get counsel, because those rules are going to be changing probably dramatically over the next months.
Okay, thank you. Trying to decipher this one a little bit. There's examples, Susie asked, examples of alternative incentives available to exempted employees. You talk about some of the incentives.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I was trying to explain there is that if you're offering, let's say, $100 bonus to employees who go get vaccinated, and you've got employees who say, hey, I can't get vaccinated, I have a medical condition, here's the proof from my doctor, right? You have to offer them that same $100. What you can do is require them to jump through some hoops in order to be eligible for that $100, right? So for instance, go through COVID safety training is the most common thing that I've seen. So that it's not just, okay, automatically you have a medical exemption, here's $100. They at least have to do something to help contribute to protecting the health and safety of the workplace.
Great. It's more of a employment practices related question, but you could maybe chime in on this. Tina asked, what do you recommend for employees who are bullying each other regarding vaccinations, non-vaccinated versus vaccinated?
Well, that would depend on the nature of the bullying. Okay. I could make an argument that whether or not somebody is vaccinated or not is a protected classification. I'm not sure that my argument would win in court, but I could make that argument. So my advice would be that, there be a discussion with the employee who is engaging in bullying, that behavior is not acceptable in the workplace. And if they keep it up, there will be disciplinary action up to it, including termination. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of legal harassment, bullying can lead to all sorts of bad things in the workplace. So I think you need to intervene and tell whoever's being the aggressor to knock it off. And then if they don't, raise the disciplinary level until ultimately they may be terminated.
Great. And document that, knock it off. Yes. The several questions, Mark, Tammy, others, and I will say that regarding the exemption forms and templates, for those that attended today, we will work to get you some examples of those sent out along with a copy of this webinar. So hold tight. We'll try to send you some examples of those and templates of those. So thanks for those questions. Rick asked, you mentioned this was pertaining to California. Are the rules different from state to state?
Well, some of the things I mentioned today are California specific, right? The COVID sick pay for employers that have more than 26 employees. That is a California rule. So outside of California, that would not apply. But in terms of the considerations when it comes to mandatory vaccination policies and the exemptions for religious or medical condition, the considerations for pay when it comes to either paying people to get vaccinated if you have a mandatory vaccination policy, or incentive pay for getting vaccinated and making sure that your overtime is correct. That is all federal law and is not limited to California.
Anna asked, and I think you addressed this, are there different rules for part-time employees? And I think the same rules apply full-time or part-time.
Yeah, generally speaking, the same rules apply.
Right. Interesting question from Jamia. Can churches require congregants to be vaccinated?
Yeah, and that's above my pay grade because that brings in all sorts of other considerations. Again, the whole vaccine passport and what independent businesses or independent organizations can require for people who patronize their establishments. That I think that's still yet to be determined. I don't think there are any clear rules on that right now. So my advice would be, if you're even thinking about doing something like that, I would check with counsel and get some legal advice on that.
Anonymous asks, can a school require its students to be vaccinated if they are old enough to get the vaccine?
Well, schools, again, is a kind of unique situation, right? Because schools already require people to be students to be vaccinated for a lot of things. And in California, you can require students to be vaccinated. Again, there is some exemption rules that apply in those circumstances, but I don't see why not, given the long history of vaccination programs in the schools. They should be, now the vaccines haven't been approved for people under age 16. So I don't think you can do anything until there's approval from the FDA for vaccines for people under 16.
Great. Mark said they're considering mandatory vaccination for congregant attendance. And if they do so, do they have to make therefore accommodations for exemptions?
Again, there's some real thorny issues there. Public spaces have rules regarding, the ADA, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act. Does that come into play when you're talking about, congregants with disabilities and not having the ability to get vaccinated? So again, that's outside the realm of employment. If you're thinking about doing something like that, I think again, there's also religious issues there in terms of whether a church organization is subject to some of these laws. I mean, it gets real complicated. So my advice would be, before you adopt something, get some advice from someone who's well-versed in the religious and public accommodation aspects of the question.
All right, we got just a couple seconds left. The last question we'll take, and then again, if we didn't get to your question, we'll try to get to those after the fact. But Michelle asked, I think we talked about independent contractors, but customers are people that use their space. Same policies apply?
No.
Okay.
Again, when we're talking about just people who use the space, they're the general public, right? They're not like independent contractors or volunteers or employees. And so, the considerations that I just discussed regarding a vaccination policy for congregants would also apply to a vaccination policy for the general public who may be using the space. I think there's a lot of things you have to look into before you can adopt that kind of a policy and enforce it.
Got it. Thank you so much, Eric. Great presentation again. And thank you, Julie, for helping us put this together. If I didn't get to your question, Eric didn't get to your question. He's been very kind to help us answer some of these after the fact. So we'll do our best to try to get those answers. And then as soon as we can get those and get a copy of this presentation, we'll send that out to you. It'll also be posted on our website as well. Last, I'll leave you with this. We're going to have a couple webinars coming up. This month is Child Abuse Prevention Month. And while we couldn't get it done in April and May, we're going to have a great presentation on sexual abuse awareness. As we start to congregate again, it definitely needs to be brought back to the forefront and discussed. So we look forward to getting that invite. And again, thank you, Eric, and thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.